First timers, the RAY is a 501c3 nonprofit charity and net zero highway testbed, paving the way for a zero carbon, zero waste, zero death highway system to build a safer and more prosperous future for all. For more, you can check out our website at theray.org. I will drop a link in the chat. Through In the Garage, we hope to spotlight technologies that could be game changers in our in a mission to build net zero transportation. Okay. Let's get into it. Today we have 30 minutes on the clock. 15 to 20 or so of those will feature our highlighted guests, and the remaining time will be used for questions from you all and answers from our guests. You can drop questions in the chat throughout the presentation. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to remind everyone that we want this space to be casual and welcoming, and also a reminder that In the Garage is a neutral environment, free of any obligations. We will be recording the presentation portion, but the Q&A will not be recorded. Today, we are also experimenting with a quick pop-up survey feature to improve our future sessions. So you will have the option to participate in that at the end. I think I about covered everything I needed to. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and hand off the virtual microphone to Peter Lemack, Project Manager at AppGeo. Peter, it's all you.
Great, thank you. And just to check, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to, again, thank the Ray for inviting me to speak with you all today and providing me the opportunity to chat about right-of-way and GIS and exploring some use cases on how DOTs across the country are maximizing their right-of-way assets. So we'll focus on three main things today. The first is exploring the value of your right-of-way as well as the data that represents it. We'll dive into the process of going and building statewide GIS data for right-of-way. And then we'll explore Colorado DOT and how they're currently using their right-of-way layers to really justify the effort that it takes to build a statewide right-of-way database. So I first want to start thinking about the value of right-of-way as well as the data that it represents. Historically, DOTs use GIS to capture assets. They capture guardrails and street sign inventories and road center lines. But typically, DOTs don't maintain a database, a geospatial database of all of their right-of-way data. And that's something that I want to talk about today. If we think about the right-of-way and the real property that a DOT owns, we know that it's an asset. And unlike a guardrail or a sign, that asset doesn't degrade over time, and the value of that asset typically increases over time. And what I want you all to think about today is that the geospatial data that can represent that physical asset, that can also be an asset to your enterprise. And the more right-of-way data that you have in a geospatial format, the more that you can use that data to solve real-world problems, to support your business units, to help the public and your communities. And the more they use that data, the more the value of that data will increase over time. So before I really get much further in, I want to take a minute to define a statewide right-of-way GIS layer. I'm assuming that most people know what GIS is. It's data that's mapped, it's data that's visual, it's queryable, and typically it's stored in one area that is accessible to the entire enterprise. And when we think about our statewide right-of-way GIS layer, we can think about a statewide collection of planning grade data, data that's typically not survey grade, but can be used for research. It can be used to answer questions, and it typically provides source paths to the authoritative source data that can give more context about that information. What's really key about a statewide layer is that it provides access to data that is, in most cases at DOTs, is typically siloed, either in regional offices or on people's hard drives or desktops. And it shares right-of-way information across all business units and departments at the DOT. When we start to think about that right-of-way layer and what it can do, we can start to think about just a couple of core questions. If we know where all of our physical assets are, if we've mapped them all out, We can answer questions like how much right-of-way do we own and what's the total value of that land? And then also thinking back to those previously siloed source documents, we can ask, where are the authoritative right-of-way documents? And then we can go and find them. But there's two questions that are particularly of interest to me today is thinking about, when you know where your physical assets are, when you have them mapped out in this right-of-way layer, we can start to answer questions like, what land is available for development? And once you know what land's available for development, you can ask yourself, what can we actually do with it? And when you ask yourself that, we can start to think about some really interesting use cases. And these are the ones that I like the best. One, we can identify vacant properties where we can build truck parking areas and to support the freight industry. We can site solar arrays and renewable energy infrastructure within the right-of-way. And then we can also place transmission lines along the right-of-way to move green energy from one location to the other. If we think about our roadway corridors as the means of moving freight and people, why not use these untapped physical land resources as a way to move energy? And then finally, one of the most common things that we can do with our right-of-way, once we know where all of it is we can evaluate it to determine, can this land be sold and can it be used? And not to get too far ahead of myself, but typically for a right-of-way project, if you sell a couple of unused properties, you can typically pay for the cost of modernizing your right-of-way and building out that statewide layer. Now, in order to get to that point where we can support truck parking and we can place solar arrays in our untapped right-of-way, there are a couple of common challenges that DOTs have that when we go through a modernization process, we can actually overcome. The first is all about data standards, about data governance and workflows. Some DOTs have them, some don't. And in some cases, those who do have data standards and data governance policies, not everyone follows them. So that's something that we need to incorporate into our process. Authoritative source data. When I say authoritative source data, I mean PDF as-builts or CAD survey documents. Sometimes those are in a non-digital format and they need to be scanned and brought into an environment that everyone has access to. And then kind of adding on to that, in a lot of cases, data is siloed. Sometimes there's PDF as-builts of right-of-way and roadways in different regional or district offices. Sometimes there's a lack of data sharing agreements that prevent plans and information to be moved from survey groups to headquarters to planners. So kind of overcoming some of these challenges is something that our modernization process will do. So let's just jump right into it. We've kind of talked a little bit about the value. So how do we actually go about building that data so that we can start to use our right-of-way and our physical assets to our benefit? So in order to kind of talk about that modernization process, I want to talk about it in the context of Colorado DOT. So starting back in 2015, AppGeo started working with Colorado, and we started the right-of-way modernization process with the goal of creating mapping grade or that planning grade GIS right-of-way data that was going to provide all of their physical assets in a geospatial environment. Colorado initially started by just wanting to focus on their land ownership outside of their acquired right-of-way. They wanted to look at their real property. They wanted to know where their excess, their remainder, and their general ledger properties were. And then they were also interested in understanding if there were any land holdings that they had that they currently didn't have cataloged in their property management system. And they viewed GIS as a really great way of not only visualizing that data, but cataloging it and making sure they had an accurate accounting. From there, we brought in the project goal to capture right-of-way along all like 9,000 miles of state-owned roadway. And along with that, we also collected information such as easements, permanent easements, slope easements, access control, property lines, things like that. And when we started the Colorado project, we needed to work with CDOT to change their frame of reference. Typically, when you think about a roadway project, it's at a project level. It's from mile marker 1 to mile marker 5. And that project has information about that stretch of road. But when we start to think about right-of-way projects across the entire state, we need to scale up to the enterprise level. And we need to not only think about the first project, but we need to think about every single project that covers all miles of state-owned roadways. So in order to do this, we focused on 3 key things. First was our stakeholders and what their objectives were. The next was the strategy for actually going and creating that right-of-way data information. And then the last bit was the repeatable solutions, how we could ensure that, you know, the very first project we processed on the first couple miles of roadway was the same as the last mile that we processed. So how do we do this? Thinking about our stakeholders. Stakeholders help us define our objectives for the project. We sat down with them, we understood their business needs, their requirements, and from that, we were able to design a data model that would allow us to store and capture information in a way that would help them answer their questions. From there, we documented business rules and processing workflows. Again, this is kind of our strategy, but it starts to blend into the repeatable solutions. We want to make sure that the very first right-of-way as-built project that we process is consistent and looks like the very last right-of-way project that we process. From there, we surveyed all of the regional offices and we cataloged thousands of data sources, CAD files, PDF as-builts. And then once we were there, we were able to start processing. And when we start processing, we need to think about things like temporality. What do we do if we have a 1990 plan overlapping a 1970 plan? How do we process both of those so that we have a consistent layer of right-of-way? And then at the end, establishing a right-of-way data lifecycle plan or a long-term maintenance plan that will allow the DOT to maintain the data in perpetuity after we hand it over to them. So this is the image on the right. This is our workflow that we developed for Colorado to process all of their right-of-way plans. The first part was, again, identifying and cataloging all of their authoritative source documents. There are about 20,000 documents. We needed to go and get them from all of the regional offices, from headquarters, as well as from their online document repositories. And once we had all that information cataloged and in a way that we could kind of assess what information that we had available to us, we then went and we built that right-of-way data set. If we had a PDF as built, we would geo-reference the plan, we would digitize it, and that's how we got the right-of-way data from that. And if we had CAD files, we would convert them to CAD to GIS and then merge everything into a single database. Now, part of that was also collecting those land holdings, those excess, the remainder, and the real property, all the different real property assets that the DOT maintained. When we were done with our processing, when we had processed about 8,500 miles of right-of-way, I think we were almost at 90% of roadway coverage, we worked with CDOT to establish a long-term data maintenance process, and that's our life cycle process. And I'll get into that in the next slide. And then once that was done, we wanted to make all of that data accessible to the enterprise, to all the business units, to all the people who needed to consume right-of-way information for planning and development purposes. So we worked with CDOT to design a series of web apps that would make that data available to everyone who wanted to view it, to query it, and to use it in their workflows. So one of the most important parts of this project is the data lifecycle. Again, this is the long-term data maintenance plan. We spent 5 years collecting right-of-way information and pulling it into an environment that was available to everybody. And we all know that our roadways are always changing. DOTs never stop acquiring roadway. They never stop selling land. And because of that, we needed to make sure that CDOT had a process that they could rely on to have information consistently flow to the GIS group that was maintaining this right-of-way information. So we came up with our data lifecycle. And really what the data lifecycle does is it establishes data sharing agreements between various business units, from the survey groups to the acquisition groups, all the way up to the GIS group, so that when land is acquired and when it's approved for sale, and the plans are completed, they'll get funneled to the right people in the GIS group, who will then go and they'll update the data. And in some cases, they'll either add missing information because we didn't get everything because we were missing plans, but maybe they acquire some land that will fill in a gap. Or maybe a new plan will come across that says, we widened the road here, we acquired right away, or we sold some land, and then the GIS group will adjust the database so that it is live, so that the information is always current and always useful to the consumers across the enterprise. So what were our major project outcomes? Like I said, we created a single right-of-way layer represented by linear features as well as polygons. There are about, like I said, 86 or so 100 miles of right-of-way data that we collected. We collected several hundred polygon representations of parcels, from general ledger to excess and remainder. In some cases, that data was, Colorado knew that they had owned that property. In other cases, these were kind of historical parcels that we had hoped that the DOT could then go and review to determine whether or not they are still actively owned by the organization. We established a lifecycle plan so that Colorado could maintain that data going forward. And then we put together that data viewer so that the information was all in one central location and shared across the entire organization. So Colorado spent a lot of time doing this, and part of your right-of-way process is to justify your initial investment and show people how useful it is, so that you can continue to maintain and grow this valuable resource. So I'll just talk through just a couple of the current use cases of right-of-way and real property at CDOT. The first one, Colorado's working with their EV planning group. They're working on rest areas and welcome centers and trying to figure out where to place EV charging facilities. CDOT's also doing an economic analysis for solar utilities across state highways. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife Group is using the right-of-way data to assess areas for low overhead dams. And then the CDOT Environmental Water Quality Group, they actually use the right-of-way data to identify new locations to place water quality facilities. So as you can see in these use cases, the data that we created, the data that the GIS group maintains, is already supporting many business units across that organization, not just right-of-way or acquisitions and survey. Like I said earlier, one of the most common use cases for mapping out all of your right-of-way data and taking an accounting of those physical assets is going through a market analysis and determining what you can sell and what you might want to use. So currently, CDOT is going through the process of evaluating those excess and remainder land holdings. And actually, it's a really good way if you can sell properties that you're not using. It's a good way to mitigate funding shortages that might pop up over time. That image on the bottom right, you can see those are points representing all of the land holdings, the excess, remainder, the general ledger properties that we identified. And part of the process for CDOT is then to look at all those parcels and determine if in fact they do maintain it and whether or not it's kind of cataloged in their property management system. One of the more interesting use cases that CDOT is using the data for is scoping passenger rail along the Front Range. And kind of throughout our project, this was one key use case for the data, that they kept asking for information on these interstates that run right up through Denver. And this data was provided, and it helped them identify corridors where they could add existing rail, or excuse me, where they could add new rail lines to existing rail to really connect that entire Front Range. And then finally, I think this occurred in 2020 and 2021, and it was one of the more recent cases where CDOT used the right-of-way data that we created. Was that there's been a series of wildfires and heavy rain out in the I-70 corridors to the west of Denver. And all of the right-of-way easement data and all of the right-of-way property data that we had collected was used to really evaluate the damage and evaluate how they could go about kind of repairing these major roadways that were closed due to damage from storms. So those are just a couple of good use cases of how CDOT is currently using that data. And hopefully, as more and more people at the DOT learn about the information, and as it improves over time, they'll be able to use it for more applications in the future. So one of the questions that I always get from people, because building out 9,000 miles of right-of-way GIS data can be fairly daunting, is how can we get started? The first thing, it all comes down to stakeholders and a project champion. Find someone who sees value in the right-of-way data, someone who sees value in GIS who can help you kind of accomplish your goals. Identify your stakeholders. Who are your, who produces right-of-way information, who consumes it, and how do they do it, and how do they want to do it in the future? From there, you can define requirements, and then you can understand the structure of your enterprise. And that really means, like, what are the different business units? Where's information spread across all the regional or district offices? How does everyone work together? From there, we can develop a process. Those are your business rules, your GIS processing workflows, how you convert CAD to GIS or just digitize the plans. And once you have those processes, you can start modernizing. You can actually start building those layers. And a really good way to kind of do that and to make sure that the stakeholders are getting what they want is to start with a pilot area. Take a couple major roads, build out some data, get some feedback, and then from there you can move forward. So I know that was a pretty quick dive into right-of-way, and there's a lot going on, but I hope that was a good kind of overview of what right-of-way can be used for, and how you can go about getting started building your right-of-way data.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. That was fabulous. We've had quite a few questions come in throughout, and I know that we just have a few minutes here, so we might just start with those in the chat, and then perhaps you could maybe follow via email afterwards. So right off the bat here, we have Matt's question. He's wondering, in your experience, how many states currently have a statewide right-of-way data layer?
I would definitely agree it's less than 50%. I know of a handful that have them.